Okay. Hi, everybody. I'm Mike Graham. I'm the Director of Technology here at Hempfield. Jeremy Paul is with me, if you were here for the Schoology session. He's our Assistant Director of Technology and is, I think, joining us here for this session. Our first session we ran tech-wise here was kind of some background about the iPads, how they're being used in class. As you may have seen, we had, we released or added a new content filter to the one-to-one iPads. Just real quick, anybody have a kid with a one-to-one iPad? Couple. I know you folks said you have a ninth grader, so they'll have an iPad next year. We made some changes this year with content filtering, and what you're going to see here this evening is mostly a presentation that I gave to the school board a couple weeks ago, talking about content filtering, the challenges of it, what we've done here at Hempfield, and what we've since activated on the student iPads, and then finally wrap up with give you kind of a preview of some tools that you will have as parents coming up here probably within another month or so. So that's what kind of my agenda here is for this session, is really focused on content filtering only with the iPads. So just to give you a little bit of background on content filtering, there's really kind of two ways to go about content filtering anything, whether it's a laptop, an iPad, whatever you will, whatever device you want to talk about. First is doing it on the network. That is, everything in Hempfield all basically goes through one point to get out to the internet. And when you filter on the network, you're basically putting in a big giant server. It sits there, it watches all the traffic go out, makes decisions about whether or not to block that traffic. This box is going to have a huge database of pretty much everything on the internet. So just about every URL you can think of is classified against categories that we can then make decisions on whether we want to block or allow it. We can do a lot of really advanced traffic management. We can do deep packet inspection and SSL decryption and all kinds of fun technical terms like that. What that really amounts to is we can really get a lot of information about what applications are being used, what web services are being used, what websites are being visited. Even if they're students maybe trying to get around, certain ports and do things in a different way, we're able to really get a good handle on what's going on when we use this more device-based or network-based filtering. Very large device, very effective, lots of options, but it is based on the network here in the district. The other method of filtering is device-based. So in this situation, all of the decisions you are making about content filtering are being made on the device itself. You're doing this without accessing external databases. It's really very dependent upon the resources that are available on that device. And when I say a device, it could be an iPad, it could be a laptop, could be any of those. That decision about whether or not to block or accept the page really kind of has to be made on the fly on that device. It's not really practical in many situations to have that giant database of URLs. You're not going to have the processing power to really do that kind of traffic inspection that you would on a network-based device. However, it is always going to be on because obviously if your laptop is working, the filter is working. So there's some pros to it, but at the end of the day, you still have pretty limited options when you talk about filtering on the device itself as opposed to filtering on the network with a purpose-built content filter. With the iPad itself, you don't have a whole lot of options as Apple gives it to you. If you are a parent, if you have an iPad at home, an iPhone that you've given your child, there is a built-in content filter that is supplied by Apple. That is the one that Hempfield used last year and used through the first month or so of school here. Basically, it gives you one option: block adult content, yes or no. If you say yes, the iPad basically tries to make its best guess about whether the content you have requested is adult. If it feels that it is adult, it blocks it and you can't get access to it. There is no other metric, there's no other category. You have really, it's a black box, if you will. There's not really a lot of controls over it. It does work very well for very clear adult content. However, it's not the greatest in those kind of gray areas that might be, okay for older kids, but maybe not, you don't necessarily want a fourth grader seeing. So that's really the only built-in way, and if you're a parent, that's your main option for filtering an iOS device at home. The other option that you have for filtering iPads is basically to tunnel all of the traffic off of the iPad and do that kind of network inspection that we did, that we talked about on the first slide. So there's a couple ways to do this. And again, this session, I do get into some technical terms, so if I say something and you're kind of wondering what is that, please feel free to ask me. But when we're talking about tunneling traffic, basically what that means is when a request is made for a website on the iPad, that request goes out to some other server somewhere out on the internet. The content filtering happens there, and if it's acceptable, that content's sent back to the iPad. If it's not acceptable, a block page comes back from that other service. On the iPad, there's kind of two ways to do that. One is through a proxy, which is a very old technology from the early days of the internet, which ironically was first developed to kind of get around censorship and content filtering. But basically, you're redirecting traffic to different places. You can also use a virtual private network, which basically opens a secure encrypted connection from the iPad to another spot. It's not really what VPNs were designed for, and there's a lot of holes in doing it that way. And really, with all of these, what you're doing is you're kind of creating a single point of failure. When we're filtering here on the network in the district, it's very easy. But when that iPad goes home, you introduce all of the networks in everybody's house all across the district. And if you're trying to bring everything back, obviously all of our stuff has to be working all of the time. The traffic has to go from your house to the district, to the internet, back to the district, and then back to your house. It's a very roundabout way to get everything back to the student's iPad. So there's a lot of challenges in doing it that way. It doesn't always work well, but it does give you a few more options than Apple's built-in content filter. When we first started one-to-one in fourth grade last year, we did attempt briefly a proxying setup for filtering. And ultimately, it broke so many things, we shut it off after about 3 hours because the iPads basically stopped working, software updates didn't work, a lot of things went wrong. So that's kind of why we didn't really look at tunneling, just because the technology really wasn't ready, wasn't working right, and some of that was iOS, some of it was just the content filters that were out there. My last bullet point there is Google. Google is a very critical part of the internet if you've stayed up to date on tech news, but one of the challenges with it is that it's very difficult. Let's say you do not want Google image searches to work. Stripping out Google image searches from Google is next to impossible, simply because of the fact that Google basically merges all of their services under one URL. So I can't just block google.com/images because Google encrypts everything, and basically everything kind of gets lumped together. And it's very difficult to strip out pieces of that. And the obvious question is, well, what if you just block Google entirely? Unfortunately, huge chunks of the internet actually rely on Google. So if I go to CNN or really any other website you can think of, they are probably referencing bits and pieces of code that are embedded in Google. And if I block Google, that in turn breaks a bunch of other sites. So Google is kind of this giant monster that we kind of have to enable, but we don't always like the way that they allow us to restrict and block searches and everything. So it really does become a challenge when we talk about filtering and doing the best we can with Google, because as many of you I'm sure are aware, Google Safe Search is not always the best and not always produces the results that we necessarily want, but stripping it out and eliminating it isn't really an option either. So before I get into kind of what the district or how the district has approached filtering, particularly with one-to-one, the other major question is that everybody always has, what are the legal requirements that we as a district are obligated to do? The biggest piece of legislation here is the Children's Internet Protection Act, which dates back to 2000, somewhere around there. There have been a couple revisions since then, but basically all it says is that we have to have a protection measure in place to block pictures that are obscene, child pornography, harmful to minors, for computers that are accessed by minors. Being a piece of federal legislation, that has basically been interpreted to attach to anything that we get federal dollars for, which, if you go the full length of it, is basically our public internet connection. And the legal opinion on that is that we're actually only obligated or required by federal law to filter the connection itself and not all of the devices on it. So as a bare minimum legal requirement, we have to filter the internet here at school. There's nothing that actually requires us to filter one-to-one devices at home, things like that. The other requirements on the law there are Internet Safety Program, responsible use policy, and things like that. However, saying that that's the minimum, every district in this area that I've ever talked to, Hempfield included, has pretty much said that's not good enough. It's not good enough that the bare minimum requirements are all we have to do is some stuff here at school and we're just going to send devices home with no filter at all. Which is why, with our program, with pretty much any other one-to-one program, we've enabled content filtering on there. Doesn't always work the way we want it to, but we're still giving it our best shot to try and filter that device no matter where it goes. It's a good thing to do. It's a responsible thing to do. It is pretty much our obligation to do whatever we can to keep those devices safe for students going home. Primary grade levels. So if any of you, I don't think there's any first grade parents in here, maybe, okay. If you have a first grader, the way we approached content filtering on first grade iPads is obviously the App Store is restricted at all grade levels this year, so that's not really an issue. However, web access in first grade, Safari is restricted to websites that the district has approved. In essence, there's a big list of bookmarks, and the only place Safari can go, which is the web browser on iOS, is that list of websites. That's all they can go to. There's no other way to get to any other sites, but it does work. And for a first grader, they're not doing a whole lot of web research at this point. Internet safety in terms of searches and information literacy hasn't come into the curriculum yet. That kind of restricted web access is not a huge deal. That said, for us, it is a very time-consuming process to build out every single conceivable URL that is going to be requested by a teacher, even in first grade. One of the challenges is, if you go to one site, that may link out to others. There may be other sites that are pulled in there. We have to go through, whitelist, and approve all of the sites that are then feeding into that main one. So there is some work that needs to be done there, even if it's just one URL or one web address that's being requested. Along with that, there's obviously a delay from the time that we get the address to when we look through it, to when we approve it, to when that gets filtered out to all of the student iPads. So again, it's suitable for first grade, but in the long term, it's not really a functional setup for other grade levels. So if we move up to intermediate grade levels, which right now for one-to-one iPads is 4 and 5, but essentially this will probably be 3 through 6 eventually in here, maybe second as well. Safari is fully enabled, but we have category restrictions set up on there that work through Securely, which I'll get into what Securely is here in a little bit. But we block all of the things that we would block here at school. So adult content, gambling, illegal activities, drugs, hate sites, I'm trying to think of some other things, violence, weapons, whatnot, things like that, as well as at the intermediate grade levels, social media, social networking, and health sites. At this point, those are blocked in grades 4 through 6. Streaming media, however, is enabled. So if you do want to watch Netflix on there and you as a parent give your kid permission, that's possible. YouTube is enabled, but in strict mode. And if you ever are curious what strict mode is, if you go into your preferences on your Google account, you can set the toggle on YouTube to strict mode. It is very, 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 very slimmed down in terms of content. It is probably, I'm trying to think of the best way to describe it, but there's literally nothing in there that's even remotely inappropriate. At least I've never seen anything in there, especially in strict mode. Google was very, very, very mindful, which is actually very odd for Google, about keeping that very, very clean. It's essentially what YouTube for Kids is built off of, if you've ever used that app. But along with that, we talked about Google a little bit earlier there. Safe search is obviously enforced with Google. Other search engines that we can't enforce safe search results on are blocked. So Yahoo, Bing, some other ones that we can't do any more granular restrictions on are not accessible. And image searches, and this is kind of a unique way that securely approached image searching. Rather than just settle with Google's safe image search, which is okay, but there's still a lot of stuff that can get into safe image searches that isn't the best. They enforce another setting, which basically requires that all image results be flagged for reuse with modification, which basically means, for one thing, it's usable in an educational setting, that students can modify that image and post it in presentations, things like that. But it also eliminates a lot of the images that are out there on the internet that are either flagged incorrectly or somebody purposely just threw up on a website to fool the search engine and show up as an inappropriate result. And that filter really does a huge amount of good in terms of cleaning out the Google results for images compared to what we normally see with Safe Search. So that's intermediate grade levels. At the middle school and on up, we enable a few more categories as kids get older. We still do all of those content restrictions that you've commonly seen, you know, the weapons, the violence, drugs, adult content. All of that's still restricted. However, social media, social networking, and health sites are now enabled once you get up to the middle school. Social media or streaming media is still enabled. Same thing with safe search and image search, just what we talked about in the intermediate grade level. Moderate YouTube is now enabled as the default in middle school. It's a step up from strict, but it's still really super clean. You have a few more current events, a few more pop culture. That's probably not even a good term for it, but generally speaking, it's still very, very, very clean compared to the full version of YouTube. And then beyond middle school at this point, we don't have one-to-one devices, but that's pretty much the template for what they will look like. We've kind of gone to this tiered approach because there's a lot of good stuff out on the internet, but at the same time, we want to kind of scale it to be what's most appropriate for the different grade levels and students in those grade levels. As you may have seen, we adopted Securely as the content filter on the one-to-one iPads a couple months ago. This was based on a lot of parent feedback, us looking at what the products were out on the marketplace, what things had evolved over the time since we had attempted some other filtering on the iPad, and you know, what we really wanted to do. And we wanted to provide the best solution we could, which previous to that, Apple was about the best solution there was. But again, Securely had a really compelling product that we looked at. Not all of the features that made the decision for us are out yet. I'm going to share the parent features here in a minute. It's a video of them. They are not out yet, but I want to say that was probably the selling point for us. We've always been very cognizant of the fact that electronic devices are treated very, very differently in everybody's household. What you do in your home may be very different than what you do in your home as far as what you allow your kids to do with cell phones, iPads, things like that. And for a long time, we've had requests for, I want to be able to enforce bedtime, or I want to be able to have better control or see what my kids are doing with their one-to-one iPad. We've never had a good way to do that. And I'm happy that Securely has at least a decent approach to beginning to enable those types of features for parents. They're the only company I've seen that's taken that route of involving the parent in the discussion, in the conversation, which is a good thing. We want to give you guys more options in how you use those devices in your home, or how your children are using those devices in your home. Basically, Securely kind of goes the route of a proxy, but they kind of approach it a little bit differently to requiring authentication so things don't break nearly as badly as they used to. It is also a cloud-based solution. So we talk about points of failure of having to bring everything back to the district. Securely lives up in Amazon Web Services, which, again, if you're not familiar with tech, Amazon Web Services is very close to the internet, for lack of a better description, but it's where a lot of content out there actually originates. So when you go through this process you're already very close to the content you're fetching. There's not a lot of back and forth that has to happen to get all of that material back to the iPad. And it can still run on top of Apple's filter as a fallback. So while Apple's filter, again, works really well for that truly adult content, we can still run Apple's filter, have it running in the background and pick stuff off if anything were to ever get through. Obviously, more granular categories. I talked about the limitations on Apple's filter. Really anything was a step up in terms of giving us the ability to block more granular categories, which is what factored into those slides on elementary and middle and high school back there, or intermediate and middle school back there. The search restrictions, talked about how that got added in there. Very happy with where that's going. And YouTube. Prior to adopting Securely, we had no ability to allow students to watch videos on YouTube. There is a lot of really good educational content on YouTube. Don't get me wrong, there's a lot of questionable stuff on YouTube as well. However, we don't really want to throw all of those good resources away. And fortunately, through the way Securely works with Google, we're able to have teachers whitelist videos inside of YouTube. Students can then just browse to YouTube, bring those videos up. They can be linked in Schoology. It's a very easy process for allowing teachers to authorize content without jumping through a lot of hoops. So the other major features of Securely that really sold us were parent access. And I kind of alluded to this a little bit before, but essentially there's two major components. One is, I believe it's a daily or a weekly report of what your child has been doing on the internet, for lack of a better description. But basically, since every kid has to log into the content filter periodically to identify themselves, we're able to match that information up with the accounts that hopefully you've created for Schoology. And that email that you created for Schoology is eventually going to be able to get daily or weekly reports on what your child has been doing on their iPad, at least on the internet. You'll be able to see things like search term, what they've been searching for in Google, what videos they've been watching, websites they've been visiting. And again, hopefully that's to have a conversation with your child, not necessarily, block everything automatically, but certainly to get a better understanding of what they're using that device for. Web portal, ultimately, you will be able to sign in and set whatever restrictions you want for use at home. So if you would like the internet to automatically shut off at 9 p.m., you can put in a bedtime in there. Now, just so we're clear, this is for the filtered portion of the iPad. Schoology, some other educational stuff, we purposely route around the filter to make sure that it is always working. So while you can shut off access to ESPN or whatever else at 9 o'clock, Schoology will still be working. So I'm sorry I can't quite shut the whole thing off, but you can shut off access to games and things like that. You also have the ability then to restrict additional categories. So we do not block games, the games category, things like that. If you would like to shut that off at home when it's off of our network, you're able to add some additional restrictions. If there's some particular website that you've seen that somehow made it through the filter that you don't want on there, you can also manipulate the block and allow lists as well. So really quickly, I will slide this over here. This is the brief video again. This feature is not actually public yet. Securely was kind enough to send me the video they've posted that kind of walks through what this looks like. They're basically signing into Gmail here. Let me skip ahead. So this is an example of what the email or the activity report looks like in an email. So you're able to see what sites they've been visiting, Google services, YouTube, Yahoo, Minecraft, Netflix. These are search terms that they saw there. It looks like they were actually looking for some things that weren't quite appropriate. If we go back there and pause it. Looks like they searched for Beyonce, Minecraft, nude, porn, and porn on Yahoo. So again, not necessarily educational. On the educational side, though, it looks like they were going to Brain Pop and Khan Academy. So it gives you a little bit more info of how that device is actually being used. If we keep going here, scrolling through, They do a lot. This is the actual parent portal. There's a link in those emails that will allow you to claim the Securely account, which then lets you apply some additional, those additional restrictions. So you still see kind of that activity feed, you know, what your child was doing on the internet come up here a little bit more in real time as opposed to that weekly report that would have come through in the email.